For the final lecture in this section of the course, I want to look at the topic of colonization and decolonization. And of course, this is important no matter where you live, but when you live in a place like Canada, this topic is particularly central and something that we've been grappling with as a society and as communities. And so really, in order to understand many of these other aspects we've been talking about in this course, we need to understand this. And it is important to note, I think I did mention it at the beginning, that a lot of social theory is European based, so it doesn't necessarily speak very clearly or well to a lot of these issues. And I really believe we need to look to other sources when we're looking at a topic like colonization and decolonization. When looking at world history, we can divide it into pre and post Columbus, and I'd be interested to know how you were taught about Columbus. When I was taught about this, it was all very celebratory, voyage of discovery, etc. And he is still an extremely contested figure, although we see increasingly holidays in the US like Columbus Day are being replaced by celebrations of Indigenous culture. Canada never had a Columbus Day, but certainly his legacy and meaning is disputed. So I invite you to go and look. It's interesting to see what the mainstream history, like Encyclopedia Britannica, things like that, say. They're very vague, they're very neutral. So we have to dig deeper to get at what Columbus really means. And so from my point of view, Columbus, I'm not going to get into the details. You can look into that on your own. But there are a number of things that are very important about Columbus, which is that system that develops as a result of him remains essentially in place. So we see this leads to things like plantation-style farming, the kind of extractive logic of mining, the conquering of supposedly new territory, and then extracting all its resources. This becomes the overarching pattern, certainly coming from European colonialism. And there are many people who say, well, this is just capitalism. And we looked at some of the Marxist theorists who were saying imperialism is just capitalism looking for new markets. That is absolutely true, but it's more than that. It's a whole cultural pattern. It has to do with how we conceive of property rights, all of these things. And so it's an absolute watershed isn't even enough of a term for it, for this coming together, which, of course, certainly from the point of view of the people that were living in the so-called New World was a catastrophe. So many of you will know that some of this was not intended. So with Europeans arriving in places like what is now North America, they brought a lot of diseases with them, which wiped out whole populations. That wasn't necessarily on purpose, but other things certainly were. So we start to see the whole idea of terra nullius. I'll be talking about this in a little bit, about that, the kind of empty land, and that certainly a Christian power can take that over. So I was looking at an article in an Irish paper, which I think from the Irish point of view, they see things differently because they were colonized themselves. So they're quoting from Columbus's diary and when he meets the Arawak nation. So he writes, "They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They can make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." So there we have it in a nutshell. And apparently he also noticed they were wearing gold jewelry. So this unleashes that whole, certainly from the Spanish Empire, that seeking of gold in what is now Mexico, Central America, South America. Just this extraction of the resources from that area that continued really until quite recently. And still South America is often imperial powers continue to interfere with their politics. So I wanted to present this first part as just a way of orienting us that we can really look at history as cleaving into two here, where a whole new system comes about. And so this is also feeds into the decline of feudalism, as these new markets open up and merchants are making fortunes in these newly discovered places. It's unsurprising that when we turn to the topic of colonization and decolonization, that we find that the major thinkers, most of them come from outside of Europe and even outside of North America. And I think this isn't surprising, as when you're in the belly of the beast, it's very difficult to really even see its outlines. It's just taken for granted like a fish in water, whereas somebody from the outside can often see things more clearly. So if we look at Durkheim, as a Jewish person in France, is seeing things from a little bit from the outside. So I want to start with Edward Said, who was Palestinian background, eventually became an American citizen, and he has been extremely important in terms of theories of empire, and so we're going to look at some of his ideas. And so Said was born in Jerusalem. You can see the dates there. And if you're in history or have studied history, you'll know this was a time of utter turmoil in the Middle East, and it was when the British controlled Palestine, and then eventually it was partitioned into Israel and has created the incredible turmoil that we're living through right now. And so Said, like so many of the thinkers we've been looking at, was not somebody who could sit back and just in his office writing. He was also an activist. He was committed to Palestinian rights up until the time of his death. And so he was born in Jerusalem. He eventually went to the United States for his he was educated in Cairo also, but then he went to the United States and eventually worked as an English professor in comparative literature. And this can seem a bit unusual coming out of literature, but really it isn't, because his theory is basically how culture contributes to imperialism and colonization. And so it isn't just armies that do this, it's literature, and now increasingly film and television. And so when I teach on popular culture, I have a whole section where I talk about this, the ways in which, for instance, Arab people are depicted in American programming. And you can almost chart the American political enemy through their film and television. So in the 60s, it was the Russian villain, right? So he's one of the first to create a really coherent theory using particularly literature, because he comes out of that. And so in his book, Culture and Imperialism, he writes that he's been gathering these ideas about culture and empire for many years and giving talks in the United States, Canada, and England, and then it becomes a book. And this is something I've found, that when you teach something, you figure it out yourself. So the book comes out of that. So he says, what are some of the non-Middle Eastern materials drawn on here? European writing on Africa, India, parts of the Far East, Australia, and the Caribbean. These Africanist and Indianist discourses, as some of them have been called, I see as part of the general European effort to rule distant lands and peoples, and therefore is related to Orientalist descriptions of the Islamic world, as well as to Europe's special ways of representing the Caribbean islands, Ireland, and the Far East. What are striking in these discourses are the rhetorical figures one keeps encountering in their descriptions of the mysterious East, as well as the stereotypes about the African or Indian or Irish or Jamaican or Chinese mind. The notions about bringing civilization to primitive of barbaric peoples, the disturbingly familiar ideas about flogging or death or extended punishment being required when they, quote unquote, misbehaved or became rebellious, because they mainly understood force or violence best. They were not like us, and for that reason deserved to be ruled. Okay, so he's using literature as a way in to look at how ideas of other cultures were constructed, and often as a way of legitimizing conquest. Said's most influential work is Orientalism, which was published in 1978. And so in this book, he focuses on the Islamic world of the Middle East and the way what referred to as the Orient. And it's always a fun question to ask where the Orient is, because it's just from where you're sitting, it's east. That's all we know. It's really a kind of construct. And it means different things at different points in history. So for the period that Said is talking about, it would have meant the Levant, and so what we now call the Middle East. And so you can see the cover here is part of the argument. So he also looks at painting, romantic painting of the Middle East and the way it's depicted. And so we see he develops this whole argument about how the Orient becomes the exotic other. So if you look at this image of a snake charmer, so the quote unquote East is holding all these exotic, slightly dangerous figures, but also very beautiful, very alluring. And so this book fell like a bomb into my area of study. So I started out in South Asian studies, and even though the book is not about India, many writers took up the idea and applied it to India, and it's the same. The way that India is depicted and still often is depicted in media as being exotic. And so this is such an important framing of this, that these things aren't neutral. And so Said also develops the idea from de Beauvoir that we looked at already of the other. So she was talking about the idea of the other as female. And Said is saying that this construction creates the Orient as other. And so whatever the Western world is, the Orient is the opposite. And in many ways, it's gendered female. The Orient is gendered female. And so the basic, I'm boiling it down, but the idea that the Orient is female, it's passive, it's emotional, it's irrational. And so I'm simplifying, but essentially the West needs to go in and it needs to deal with this because it can't rule itself, even though they've been managing for thousands of years without any intervention from anyone else. So this continues. I just want to be really clear. I know we like to think, oh, this is a thing of the past. But if you look at the way Iran is being depicted right now in the media, or many of the countries in this region, I don't think a lot has changed. It's often the idea of the Oriental despot, the dictator, and so on, right? And that's not saying there aren't things going on in Iran, but I don't know. It's sort of the whole thing of casting stones when you're living in a glass house. So Said is making this argument that all of these texts, including fiction, go into developing our ideas about this exotic other. And so, as I said, when I teach on this in terms of film, I show different images. I can't go into a lot of detail here. But if we look at movies from the 20s and 30s, the way Asian people are depicted, and this was at a time when the US and Canada were moving to make Asian immigration illegal or place a head tax. So we can see how films, TV, books sort of work hand in hand to create these images. And so this is just so important. I remember reading it, and it just makes you interrogate your whole way of conceiving of other cultures. So this has been one of the most influential texts of the last 50 years or so. This quotation is taken from Orientalism, and this is where he starts to sketch out his larger argument. So he writes, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient. Okay, so this is sort of overarching way of dealing with this region of the world. So dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. And this is where when I said when the bomb fell. So academia, there were actually departments called, Oriental Studies in many parts of Europe and North America. And so a lot of renaming that had to happen, but also a lot of soul searching. And so the idea, and this is something that I've discussed a little bit, but the idea that how you teach things is a political act in and of itself. It's not neutral. And so if I teach, the colonization of other countries as something inevitable or as something neutral, that's a political stand that I'm taking. So he linked academia with this larger project. And it's not just academia, it's journalism, travel writing, all of these things. Now, obviously, within that, there are dissenting voices. But certainly this did, and rightly so, it caused a lot of soul searching in the disciplines of what used to be called Orientalism and South Asian Studies. So we had to rethink our curriculum. And so, in short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So he's basically saying it may be literature, it may be journalism, but it's still a mode of controlling the Orient, right? Or that region, of dominating it. So this is there's a whole book called The Rhetoric of Empire, and it looks at early travel writing. And when I read it, it really put into perspective why I often feel uncomfortable with travel writing, because travel writing really partakes of that whole idea of, I'm going to go somewhere quote unquote exotic, and I'm going to take pictures of the people and take them back and show them to people and be like, isn't this interesting, these exotic people and the exotic things they do. So really, we can see travel writing is very implicated in this whole process. I want to move on to looking at Fritz Fanon now, who is one of the most important thinkers of our time. And he was born on the island of Martinique while it was still under French colonial rule. So you can see from a very different part of the world than Said, but still dealing with colonial structures. And so he drew on a wide array of sources, and I'll be attaching a write-up on him to Blackboard. So he looked at poetry, psychology, philosophy, and political theory, and wrote extremely influential books, originally in French, Black Skin, White Masks, when he was only 27, and The Wretched of the Earth. And so he was committed, as we are seeing, not just to writing. He was an activist and a revolutionary. And so he actually moved to Algeria, which was in throes of a colonial war against the French and trying to assert its independence. And so he moved there to be part of that anti-colonial struggle and part of decolonizing Algeria. He was a member of the Algeria National Liberation Front and ambassador to Ghana for the Algerian Provisional Government. And he traveled extensively across Africa. So he was also part of that larger Pan-African movement. And so Fanon has been influential in a wide variety of ways and widely read across disciplines. And so he himself practiced as a psychiatrist. And so he doesn't just talk about colonization as a political kind of process. He talks about how it impacts the psychology of the colonized. And so what we might be calling mental illness, he would say is actually just a normal reaction to somebody who's being colonized. And so he's undercutting also these structures and saying we need to look at what we mean by mental illness in terms of the pressures that people can be under. So he's very much taken up by Marxist theorists, but he's also used within looking at critical race theory. I want to look at this section from The Wretched of the Earth, and you will see by the way he writes that why he's popular. He doesn't pull any punches here. So he says, "Let us waste no time in sterile litanies and nauseating mimicry." Okay, so he's saying here that he's not interested in going over and over and over these things from the past that these colonial powers have done, and he's also not interested in mimicking European culture. And this is a very powerful stance, this idea of rejecting that, sort of having to assimilate to fit in, to maybe get a few crumbs from the table. He's rejecting that. Leave this Europe where they are never done talking of man, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets in all the corners of the globe. Okay, so he's basically taking aim at a lot of the thinkers we've been looking at, particularly probably the French thinkers, right? Who are talking about egalite and brotherhood and all these things, and he's saying yes, they talk about it all the time, but in reality, in these colonial settings, people are being killed in a variety for a variety of reasons. And oppressed. So we know that it is not a homogeneous world. We know, too, that enslaved people are to be found there, to some who have attained a simulacrum of phony independence, others who are still fighting to obtain sovereignty, and others, again, who have attained complete freedom, but who live under the constant menace of colonial oppression. Okay? So you can see why he's still red. This is still true. So it's often been said that while Africa... The nations of Africa are free, quote unquote, we know that those colonial powers are still controlling the economy in many of those countries, particularly where there's mining interests. So the French, the Chinese, the British, they're all still there. And so they might not rule it overtly, but in many cases their hand is there ruling it covertly. So this is still, so he talks about a simulacrum of phony independence. And then the ones who, we can just look at Cuba, for instance, and what's going on with the blockade against Cuba. There's this constant menace for the countries that have achieved independence that these colonial powers will move in and interfere with their government. I want to turn now to a thinker from yet another part of the world. That's Gayatri Spivak, or Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She was born as Gayatri Chakravorty in Kolkata, India, in 1942. So while India was still under colonial rule by the British. And so she's referred to as a literary theorist, feminist critic, post-colonial theorist. And she's a professor of comparative literature like Said. And she's often lumped in with the postmodernists. I chose to put her in this section. I could have talked about her in the section on postmodernism, but I do think I think she fits really well when we're looking at critiques of colonialism. Now, I'm not going to prevaricate here. She's tough going to read her. And I remember trying to read through some of the work when I was preparing for a job interview years ago. And I actually saw with some amusement online, people were like, can you please explain to me what she's saying? So this has been one of my critiques of, it's not just her, of postmodern writing. I sometimes do wonder, do you actually want people to read this and understand it? And I do think this is the difference between the postmodernists and people like Fanon or Said. They both wanted to be read and understood by the masses of people. But nonetheless, Spivak's work has been extremely influential, and so I do want to just turn to look at some of her ideas. So I did find it on Reddit. Can anyone help me understand Spivak's "Can the Subaltern Speak"? I have no clear idea what it means, even having discussed it in class. And then the infamous task of understanding it. And we desperately need it for dummies version. I don't know about that. But you really need to parse it and look at it closely. That is for sure. So Spivak has won a number of honors, including the Padma Bhushan, which is one of India's highest honors that she received in 2013. She also won in 2025 the Holberg Prize from Norway. So she's recognized as one of the most important thinkers of the time. And so let's have a look at this and see what we can make of it. Here's a woman who tried to be decisive in extremis. She spoke, but women do not hear her. Thus, she can be described as a subaltern, a person without lines of social mobility. Now, this is very much of its time. I think I spoke to this about postmodernism. The actual structure of their writing is part of what makes it confusing. So, for instance, the quotation marks around spoken here, for instance. So she's basically talking, the subaltern here, the actual word is a term for a junior military officer in the Imperial British Army, but she's using it to mean people who have no power within society, people who are oppressed. And so she says, yet the ventriloquism of the speaking subaltern is the left intellectual stock in trade. So it's been said that she's been very critical of Western feminism, for instance, what she calls bourgeois feminists who attempt to speak for all women. That has been one of her strongest critiques. And feminism has really had to take these criticisms on board of and also look at things like race, look at things like colonization, look at things like class. So to me, she seems to be saying here that academics claim to speak for these groups. And so she says the left wing in particular, left wing intellectuals claim to speak for these groups. But in fact, it's not. It's not the subaltern themselves speaking. Okay? So the problem with this, from my point of view, is she herself is an academic and writing. So then, if you can't do that, then what are you doing? So I think this is what leads us into the confusion, and this is very much true of many of these postmodern thinkers because they seem to write themselves out of existence. But I do think we can take on board her criticism of anyone, they don't have to be on the left, of anyone speaking for others and not actually listening to the voices of people themselves. And this critique has been taken on board by a lot of different academics who, for instance, this is why I use a lot of anthropology in many of my other courses, because they actually interview people and ask them, why are you performing that ritual? Why is this important to you? And get it from the actual person instead of attempting to speak for them. But nonetheless, you're reshaping it yourself when you're rewriting it. So it's a tricky business. But I think she's one of the most important people to be contributing to the idea of intersectionality, that all of these forces is not just about gender, it's not just about class, it's all of these things together. In this final section, I'm going to move us closer to home, and we are certainly right in the midst of this process. So it's a little difficult to speak about it on a certain level, but it is necessary nonetheless. And many of you will be aware of the various attempts at decolonization that we've been doing at Nipissing and that the government's been doing and communities have been doing. I was, a few years ago, really struck that it was some kind of a hockey event, but they did a land acknowledgement in Mississauga. The word Mississauga, I grew up in that area, and it was, you just vaguely knew that was the original people that lived in that region. And they do land acknowledgements on the radio in North Bay all the time. And I know there's a whole issue around the kind of, is this an effective way of dealing with the problem? I'm not saying it's the only way. The land acknowledgement has to then lead to action. But it's certainly the first step. And I say this because, as I said, I grew up in the region of Peel. We learned nothing about the treaties or the history, nothing. And so this has been a very important first step, no matter how kind of sometimes it seems insincere. Nonetheless, I've noticed people doing the land acknowledgements now will often add in their own personal history to it, or something personal, which I think is a great way of trying to make sure you're not just reciting it kind of blankly. So you can see in this picture, these protesters have written Rescind the Doctrine, and I'm going to be talking about that as we move through. And certainly right back to Columbus, the idea of mapping becomes so important, because mapping was one of the key ways that imperial powers have taken over areas. So I finished a book recently on the Hudson's Bay Company, and so it would be part of what it was doing was mapping out the territory of what is now Canada, and then you can gain control of it. If you don't know where the mountains and the rivers and the lakes are, it's very hard to traverse it. And so mapping, again, is very political. And so I've used the term Turtle Island because this is an indigenous mapping of the area that we live on. It's making it part of indigenous worldview, that it's living, the earth is alive. It's on the back of the turtle. Many of you will know that creation story of Sky Woman coming down and the animals cooperating with her to create Turtle Island, where we all live. So I think this process, there are so many moving parts to it, and we're just really in the beginning stages. Most or all of you will be aware of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action for Canadians, and that included in education. And so those of us who work in education, we take the whole document seriously, but certainly that part is where we have a little bit of control. And so, as I said, this is an ongoing process, and so much in the Canadian case has come from the grassroots. I talked about Idle No More in the other section of the course, and so we just recently lived through this, and I do want to talk about this. So in 2021, there was a horrific discovery in Kamloops, BC, of a mass grave of 215 children, and so with no identification whatsoever. And this caused shockwaves through all of Canada. And because when we look at mass graves, it's hard not to think about genocide, because why would you hide it? Why would you not even put identifying like markers on the graves, right? And so we at Nipissing, the Office of Indigenous Initiatives set up, there was a memorial service, and elders were saying prayers, and it was outside. It was outside the student union building. But this was happening at the same time as the 150th anniversary of Canada, and it just, none of us could celebrate. It was just impossible. It was like the whole country was kind of thrown into a state. And so as part of this, shoes started to appear, and I was walking by the Pro Cathedral in North Bay and saw them. People, we don't know who, often it was Indigenous communities, were putting shoes on the staircases of various Canadian institutions, children's shoes. And so there was also a massive one on Parliament Hill that I also saw. Very, very eerie. So to me, it reminds me of the at Auschwitz, where they would show, the items that belonged to these people that were murdered or dead. And so the idea that these personal items evoke these children. So so they put them outside the churches, because the churches, as you will know, were often the ones running the residential schools, but they also put them outside Parliament, because the Canadian government was obviously the real prime mover in all of this, of forcing Indigenous children into residential schools. So this is what I was getting at the beginning, that for me, this is less about finding a thinker and looking at their ideas than it is a grassroots movement, as Canadians are trying to come to terms with this history and what we're going to do moving forward. As a result of this discovery, the Pope was, I believe our Prime Minister was pushing him to come, but he certainly felt pressure to come, and there were various delegations sent by First Nations to the Pope over the years. And so finally, Pope Francis visited Canada specifically to go to Kamloops and discuss this situation. And so part of the background to this is that the Anglican and United Church had already officially apologized for residential schools, but the Catholic Church had not. And so this was part of that process. Pope Francis looked very uncomfortable. I watched the whole thing on CBC. And but it was, nonetheless, it was extremely important that he came and took this seriously and apologized. Certainly it's not the whole thing, but it's a very important step, and something that First Nations had been pushing for many, many years. And so when we were watching this footage, there were people in the crowd from various First Nations holding up signs. And so, like the one in the earlier slide that said rescind the doctrine. So, that is referring to the doctrine of discovery. And some of you may know about this, but this was promulgated by the Vatican at a time when the Vatican was still controlling Catholic countries. And so they were deciding who could trade where and who could travel where in terms of the so-called voyages of discovery. And so that's a whole long history. It's very interesting if you want to look into it. But these were what were called papal bulls, and they were considered legally binding. And so the Vatican would decide, for instance, Portugal has the right to this area, Spain has the right to this area. And so part of the idea was that whoever discovered this place, if it was a Christian explorer and they were non-Christians, then they could just take it over. Okay, and so this is seen as the underlying structure of all of colonization. So the call to rescind this is very, very important. And so the other part of this is terra nullius, and many of you will know what this is, the idea of empty land. So this conception on the part of people like Columbus that when they get, I mean, obviously he met the Arawak, he knew there were people there, but from a European point of view, it was empty territory that they could take over. And so this still exists, I have to say. I find in the language that people use for the far north, if they want to be mining, it's like it's empty territory. Like there's no animals up there, like there's no nature, that there's no communities up there. In the sort of imaginary, it's empty. So these two concepts, there's many other ideas, but these were key. And the doctrine of discovery was actually officially rescinded as a result of this pressure in 2023, so very quickly after this visit. And it doesn't get much publicity at all, but this to me is like the Columbus coming here. This is a watershed moment. This is going to be a before and after, because if you rescind the doctrine of discovery, that is the whole basis of colonialism. And so that means if you take it logically, then we have to look at the whole thing. And so, of course, most people are, have their fingers in their ears and they're like, I don't see that. I'm just going to continue on as is. But nonetheless, it has really important repercussions legally. As I mentioned, part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions dealt with education, because obviously education is very important in terms of how we start deconstructing a lot of these structures. And so Nipissing has been part of this process. It's been very challenging, as it is everywhere. And certainly the latest version of the plan for Nipissing integrates a lot of these ideas, and also the recognition that Nipissing is on Nipissing First Nation territory. So part of the problem with all of this is the same with the land acknowledgements, that it can become a kind of paying lip service and then just moving on with business as usual. So we did, for instance, do a curriculum scan where Dr. Cindy Pelche came to all of us and went through our courses, and to see if she could, contribute to, first to see what was being taught, and also if there are ways to help, because this is an ongoing issue of how do you teach it? How do we help people to teach it in a proper way? And so many of you will have experienced this. Many of the professors at Nipissing bring in elders to speak to the class rather than trying to speak for them. So one of the efforts was polishing the chain, which I was involved in, and it should say polishing the covenant chain. It has to do with the idea, which I think is vital, that we go back to understanding the treaties. And so Morris Switzer talks a lot about this. He was involved in this effort. And so the idea that we return to understanding of ourselves as being in treaty. And so this isn't something from the distant past. And so this is why I think land acknowledgement is important. And I've given the assignment on numerous occasions with students to look into the treaty they were born on, and or if they weren't born in Canada, then where they're living, And I had one student who could trace right back to the land her family was on and who lived there originally. So I think this is a very important part of the larger process. But there were many speakers who came, and the keynote was Dr. Alanis Obomsawin. So I want to just talk a little bit about her because we were so fortunate to have her come here. So Alanis Obomsawin has quite a special relationship with Nipissing. She's been on campus numerous times, and she had a close relationship with Dr. John Long from the education faculty, who wrote a very important book called Treaty 9 about the treaty process north of here in the James Bay area. And so she agreed to come. Actually, the president, he knew how to reach her, so arranged for her to come. And it was one of the great highlights of my life to meet her. And she gave a very inspiring talk as the keynote speaker. And so she was actually born in the US, but returned to her home reserve with her family in Quebec, and started out her life as a musician. Apparently, she still sometimes is a musician, but she's most well known for her work as a filmmaker, particularly about issues to do with Indigenous communities. And so she made a film on alcohol and drug abuse called Poundmaker's Lodge, A Healing Place in 1987. Services to Homeless Indigenous People in Montreal, No Address, 1988. Her films on the struggles of the Micmac over fishing rights. So you can see her work is activist, right? And the most influential is Kanesatake, 270 Years of Resistance. I've used this numerous times in my courses. And I really encourage you to watch this film. I think every Canadian should watch this film. You can watch it on the website for the National Film Board. And it's about the Mohawk government standoff at Oka in 1990. And this is one of the worst moments in Canadian history. So there was a land claims issue where the Quebec government wanted to put, or the community there wanted to put, a golf course on what the Mohawks were saying was their sacred land and a burial ground there. And so in this film, they get incredible access, and you're right in the heart of it when, unbelievably, the Prime Minister sent in the army. It was absolutely horrifying. And so she's right in there with her cameras. So I really encourage you to watch this film. And I think this was a wake-up call for Canadians, that there's a tendency to think, oh, this is in the past, and that these are ongoing issues. I just saw recently they were trying to put a ski resort somewhere in BC, and it was actually, the land was given back to the community, the Indigenous community. But this is ongoing, and as I said, we always have to keep looking at the land. But what I was really struck by when Alanis Obomsawin was here was her optimism, and she's in her 90s, and she's just a going concern, still working on projects, and just completely optimistic about the ways that we can move forward, which I found to be very inspiring. There are many, many books now being written about settler dynamics, reconciliation from many, many different angles. And one of the most important, I think, is the Reconciliation Manifesto by Arthur Manuel, who was a longtime activist for his community and for Indigenous people everywhere. And so he, again, like Fanon, doesn't pull any punches, and he's extremely critical of the Trudeau government. And he was also part of those groups going back and forth to the UN. He was really one of the people instrumental in trying to use the UN as a way to pressure Canada, which has been effective overall because they've been shamed kind of internationally. So one of his main arguments is, well, let's look at this quote. Today, as Indigenous people, we confront our greatest hopes and our greatest fears. We see a new and very public openness in Canada towards us and our rights, and lofty talk of reconciliation and a shared path into the future. Okay, so this is often the critique, and often the critique of apologies. So, for instance, the apology by Stephen Harper on behalf of Canada regarding residential schools. Obviously, it's important, but just saying things is not enough. It has to come through in law. It has to come through in action, and which is partly why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had calls to action. So it's not just you read through it. And so many thinkers that I've read and activists have said you can't have reconciliation without the part of justice. So if that isn't happening, you can't move on to reconciliation. It just becomes a way of papering over everything. So he says, but in the shadows behind the scenes, the negotiations to force us to surrender our Aboriginal title to our lands continue apace. In fact, they may even be accelerating. Okay, so he's saying that on one hand, the government is saying it's going to start this new chapter. And then on the other hand, he's speaking specifically about BC. And in the case of BC, there aren't even any treaties. So according to him, there's been this constant effort to remove any idea of Aboriginal title and to get these nations to sell the land back to BC. Now, as many of you will understand, this goes completely against their worldview. You can't treat land as property. It's not something you can sell. It's something sacred. And so this is just a mess with all of these pipelines that they want to put through, and the RCMP has been sent in with mining and all of these things. And so really you can see this, that colonialism is alive and well, all the same ways through force, through violence, through extraction. These are all still going on. So he's making a really, really important point here. So he's making the argument that Indigenous communities have to have enough land to support themselves economically, and that has to happen so in order for reconciliation to take place. So I wanted to conclude right back here in North Bay. There's an underpass that I often walk through, and I noticed this recently on the wall, so I took a picture, which is land back. And I want to end with this because, as Arthur Manuel says in the Reconciliation Manifesto, it's about land rights ultimately. And all the other things are good and helpful, but unless there's actual action on this, it's reconciliation really becomes impossible. So because right from Columbus, it was always about land and being dominant over an area of land and people. And so the land back movement is part of a larger pan-Indigenous movement. So it includes US, Canada, Australia, Mexico, and is this call for traditional lands to be returned. Okay, so currently it's hard to get a number on this of how much Canadian land is held on reserves. It goes between 0.036 to 5. I think it's on the lower end personally, but regardless, that's a tiny amount. And so just to give some idea, apparently the Navajo Reserve in the United States contains as much land as all of Canada's reserves. So they're tiny. And so as Arthur Manuel said, with a land base like this, you can't sustain the community. It's just too small for the scale of what's needed. So this is really pressing that communities can gain control of land. And so in the Canadian case, the ones I'm more familiar with, there was actually a case that was settled with Nipissing First Nation and then and the Robinson-Huron Treaty. There's an ongoing one with the Algonquin Nation because there's huge amounts of unceded territory, like Manitoulin Island, actually Ottawa, weirdly. So these are ongoing land claims issues that need to be resolved. And there's been many creative ways this has been happening. So for instance, when the Hudson Bay Company was beginning to fold, it's been giving huge swaths of its buildings to Indigenous communities, which I think is fantastic. We also see communities, I know at Nipissing First Nation, they've been buying up land to extend the reserve. So there's many ways this has been happening. And I had a student that was from Rama near Barrie, and this was never in the papers, by the way, but they got a huge land claim settlement, apparently, which was one of the great successes. And this is the other thing, we don't often hear about it, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So I wanted to end with this, that obviously this course is about thinkers and critical theory and so on, but all of that is predicated on these larger systems. And so we need to be thinking about what's actually happening on the ground and where we live.